is resolved. I don't think I heard that. Go ahead. Who needs to chair? All right, well, welcome everybody. Congratulations for making it to the final round. If you guys don't have questions, we can start, or not. You good? Good. All right. So we'd like to recognize the Prime Minister for a 7-minute constructive.
Okay, so for a quick round of thank yous before I start my time, I just want to thank our opposition team for being here today and congratulate you all for being in the final round with us. We're excited about it. Thank you to our judges for taking time out of your day to be here and judge. I know it's been a long weekend. Thank you, Hunter. This has been a great tournament. I'm so excited to be in finals with you. It's going to be fabulous. And thank you to our large peanut gallery for being here to watch. All right, so with that, I will start with my speech. All right, our resolution today is resolved. This House believes that blood quantum laws should be abolished. For a quick resolutional analysis, we're going to define this House as the advocacy of the room. We're going to define believes, saying that the word believes indicates that we will evaluate this topic in a values-type context. We're going to define blood quantum laws as laws originally passed by the U.S. Congress and adopted by Native American tribes to determine who is eligible for tribal enrollment based on their racial makeup. We're going to define abolished as formally put to an end or put out of practice. Our value for the round will be equality, and our criterion is going to be ethics. All right, contention 1. Blood quantum laws are rooted in a deeply racist system. Point A on this contention. Blood quantum is, at its most basic, a European institution that descends from primogeniture laws. The oldest son inherits everything, etc. Before European invasion, Native American tribes did not have anything like this where they would just like kick you out if they felt like you weren't Cherokee enough or you weren't Apache enough. Instead, they actually freely adopted individuals into their midst. Offensive terms like full blood, half blood, a quarter blood didn't exist at this time, so we have to understand first and foremost that this is a fully European institution and has nothing to do with the Native Americans themselves. Our viewpoint on this is that these laws were originally created by the United States government in an effort to determine how much quote-unquote Indian blood any given individuals have. It was super offensive because they could actually use these determinations to allow quote-unquote whiter Indians to have greater rights. They could allow people who had less Native American blood to actually vote before they allowed people they considered full-bloods to have these types of rights. Full-blooded Native Americans could not represent themselves in court for an extremely long time, and this becomes ultimately problematic because it leads us into this whole mindset that white is right and that we should devalue people based on their racial makeup. It's very problematic. Okay, the C point here is that later the U.S. government decided to use these laws to determine who could actually be a citizen of Native American tribes and thus who could actually receive their government benefits. So that became really problematic because here we have a primarily white European government determining who is Native American and who is allowed to be a citizen. This is deeply offensive because ultimately it's removing sovereignty and self-determination from these Native American tribes. So the impact that we get from this that we can still see today on the D point is that millions of Native American people and their descendants have been totally disenfranchised from tribal citizenship because of these past laws. So you have people today that probably are Native American and they can't receive any of these benefits and they can't be culturally identified with their tribe because of the practices that our U.S. government put in place in our history. It becomes very problematic. The contention 2 here is called exclusionary practices. The A point here is that these laws are abused by corrupt governments, and we have a couple solid examples of this that we feel are important to talk about. One example is where the Cherokee freedmen were disenrolled in the 1980s, and what basically happened is that anyone who had mixed Cherokee and African blood, or anyone who descended from African Americans that were also in the Cherokee tribe, were basically kicked out. They said, you know what, you're not Cherokee anymore, you have to move off our land, you're not going to receive any of our benefits, and I'll take your first of 2 questions.
Considering the fact that blood quantum laws are put in place by the tribes themselves, wouldn't your interpretation of how bad the Cherokee interpretation is buy your argument that we're imposing values on people?
Right, I'm actually going to get to that, but this is just like the point that it was ultimately put in place by a European government, and we really want to specify here that we believe that this needs to be abolished for the sake of the Native American people themselves, not necessarily for the sake of their governments. We're calling their governments corrupt and saying that like they should not be able to disenfranchise these Cherokee freedmen and just say that they are not going to be members of the tribe. I'll go ahead and take your last question, but I really need to move on.
Sure. So considering the fact that blood quantum laws are the only way that Native Americans can identify with a tribe specifically, under your premise, how will they identify as Native Americans?
Well, we're not trying to implement a plan here, right? We're just saying that like we believe this is wrong and it should be abolished. We can talk about that more if you want to bring it up again. Okay, another example that we have is very recent, actually in 2011, where several small California tribes actually decided to kick out a bunch of their members essentially so that they could actually share like greater profits from government help and from casino help. So that was really problematic. They were basically saying, you know what, we all need more money, so we're just going to kick out the people we don't like. That's really wrong. We probably shouldn't just kick out the people that we don't like and totally disenfranchise from like their cultural heritage. The B point here is that blood quantum laws are actually really hard to undo, which may help clarify the question that was just asked. The Navajo Nation accepted a suggestion from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, like all the way back in the early 1900s, to limit tribal enrollment to people who were 1/4 Navajo or more. And even though they realized that this is like totally decimating their population and meaning that they like can't identify Navajo children who are born like 1/8 or 1/16, they find that it's very difficult to undo because of practical concerns, because then they have to think about all of these other issues, like are we going to re-enroll people that were originally like booted in 1911? Are we going to re-enroll their descendants? So it really causes a lot of problems and practical concerns that are hard to address. C. Again, this is deeply rooted in racism and perpetuates exclusionary practices and allows rejection of citizenship based on race. This is unethical, especially when an individual actually has citizen parents. Like, we're basically dehumanizing them. We're saying that, like, they have a pedigree and they're the only race in the world that needs to prove that they're actually Native American. Like, it's basically like a dog show where you're like a full blood or half or whatever. It's really horrible that we're actually dehumanizing these people and saying that we have to prove that your culture is, like, legitimate and that your race is legitimate. Okay, the third contention, really quick, cultural genocide. A. These laws slowly whittle away Native American tribes, since the only way to ensure your children and descendants are citizens is to marry within the tribe. So that leaves you with very little personal choice, or on the alternative, your children are no longer citizens. B here. If these trends continue, no one will be allowed to be officially considered Native American by the U.S. government within the next 4 to 6 generations. This means that all benefits are taken away, reservation lands go back to the government. It's extremely problematic. In conclusion, we believe that blood quantum laws should be abolished because they are unethical and detrimental. They're extremely dehumanizing, and they're going to cause all of these problems in the future, where basically, even though we have people that still identify culturally as Native American, their parents are Native American, ultimately they're not going to be considered Native American by their government, and so suddenly they just aren't anymore. It's problematic.
Thanks. I'd like to recognize the Leader of Opposition for an 8-minute constructive.
Brief roadmap to start off time. I'm going to go with 3 off-case contentions, but I'm going to give it a general observation. 3. All right, before we start time, finals, we all are winners, yay. Market of times, and let's get started. Okay, so we get the impression that the federal government is imposing their white Eurocentric, framework on these Indians, Native Americans, in terms of using the change over here. And we find this a bit misleading to begin with, because what's not recognized is that blood quantum laws have been reformed for several periods during colonialism, and the most current form is under the Indian Reorganization Act, which gives the tribes the authority in determining their own things. It's very important in evaluating your idea of this imposition of European Eurocentric values upon the tribes. That being said, contention 1 of case. By the way, we accept this as a value. We accept the definitions, and we also accept the idea of equality and ethics. It's going to be important because this applies to Native Americans. That being said, abolition of blood quantum laws violates Native Americans' right to self-determination. A, Indians should be allowed to determine membership by their own rules. According to the logic of my opponents, we understand that they should be the ones to determine their own self-determination. B, no single standard for tribal memberships would ever be adequate because it turns control of the tribe over to those who don't have the tribe's best interest at heart. What do I mean? If you abolish blood quantum laws as a value, you say that they are bad things, should be done away with, then who is supposed to be determining the self-determination of the tribes, but the tribes themselves? What happens? It opens the tribes up to internal, external influence from other persons, and it doesn't have the best equality of the tribes at heart because it removes the self-determination of the tribes themselves. C, what we have to understand is that abolition of blood quantum laws to determine tribal membership will water down its meaning by over-expanding tribes, and now no tribal members will be allowed to make decisions for the tribe. What does this mean? Because tribe, you can't think of Native Americans as Native Americans. They're distinct tribes, distinct cultures, and they're almost pseudo-states. So we realize that because these pseudo-states have their own ideas of membership, removing blood quantum laws as an abolition framework would essentially over-expand the tribes and water down the idea of tribal membership as a cultural identification. This is bad for the equality of the tribes, and it's not ethically sound because the tribes want it. Contention number 2. Blood quantum laws, just to give you a second, blood quantum laws are a necessary counter to the effects of colonialism. Now, this is going to really just get rid of most of their arguments. What we have to understand is that they keep on saying that, we should just have an equality and openness and we don't need these special things. The fact of the matter is that colonialism was imposed upon the Indians. They were disadvantaged. What blood quantum laws allow is for some equity to be restored. So BQLs, I'm going to call it BQLs for now, are to counter the effects of colonialism. Colonialism desecrated the land rights of the natives. Colonialism desecrated the lands of the natives, and eliminating blood quantum laws opened the door for a new colonial era due to false claiming of Indianhood. Because what's going to happen when you abolish these ideas of Indianhood that the tribes determine, then you have a free-for-all where Native American where tribal Cherokee gets replaced by Native American. And there's no tribal membership here, and this is going to be detrimental to countering the effects of colonialism that blood quantum laws allowed for. Yes?
Yeah, can you name me any other group besides dogs and cats that have to prove that they have some kind of pedigree to be considered a member of that group?
One group are Native Americans. That's the point I'm making.
Any other group though besides
No,
Native
I'm going to tell you why it's a false analogy. Because you try to evoke the emotion of pedigree and dog classing, but that's really a Western position, and the tribes don't view it this way. The tribes view it as determining the cultural identity of persons. They don't view determining who becomes a member of their tribe as some livestock paradigm or some pedigree pure blood paradigm at all. They view this as what makes cultural identity. So it's completely foolish and misleading for you to say that we should allow them to not degrade themselves by calling them pedigrees or pure bloods. They're not calling themselves pedigree or pure bloods. It's misleading. Finally, we understand the final point of this contention too is that people of mixed ancestry increasingly self-identify, and as such, we find, let's example, let's say Destiny or Judge were to show up in a dashiki and dreads and call herself African. What happens is that, that's true, let's give an example. What happens is that blood quantum laws prevent my African tribe, maybe you don't like this division, but they prevent my African tribe from being watered down by persons who self-identify. Self-identification is the biggest thing in the 21st century, where persons say, oh yeah, I'm 1/2400,000 Indian, accept me in your Cherokee tribe. But quantum laws prevent these things, and the government team on their value of equality completely erodes this because they're understanding that these things are serve to counter the effects of colonialism. Colonialism dissipated the cultural identity of these people. Blood quantum laws counter these effects. When you remove them, you open the door for new colonialism. Contention number 3, destruction of Indian identity. This is the overarching most important contention. Arrival of Europeans changed group identity, and the concern of Indians have been commodified and expropriated through continuing colonialism. What do I mean? All of those bad things I spoke about, not being able to give credit in court, these white Indians, all of these things are relics of the colonial past. What blood quantum laws do is they allow for these relics where, people, you're only a white Indian, only persons choose to get to vote. Blood quantum laws allow for certain standards to be implemented regarding identity that are no longer commodified or racially based. Very important. They transfer agency from the white oppressors or the English oppressors to the oppressed. That is what blood quantum laws do. They transfer agency. As such, if you stand on a value basis to abolish them, you destroy the Indian identity that the reorganized blood quantum laws allow to invest agency into. Why is that a bad idea? Because it will shift the social and cultural base of definitions from the legalistic and cultural to based on arbitrary definitions. Because essentially, if you repeal blood quantum laws, what does it now mean to become a Cherokee? What does it mean? The Cherokees currently decide this. If you abolish blood quantum laws, you shift this to an adverse way. Let's go on to the affirmative case now. We understand that they say it's rooted in racism, and their subpoint is it's a European institution, and all of these things about invasion, offensive terms, and nothing to do with the natives. What this does, it ignores colonialism. What do I mean? All of these things about how bad it was to classify Indians no longer apply to current blood quantum laws. Current blood quantum laws have been reorganized to a way, once again, cross-applied to previous points, that have been reorganized in a way that invests agency in Indians. So all this first contention about rooted in racism, actually now it reverses the roots of racism. That's what current BQLs do. So they're not rooted in racism, they're rooted in racial identity. That's not racism. Subpoint B, and the group all that A together. B, US government allows for discrimination, no courts, white Indians. Again, this isn't a risk under blood quantum laws because blood quantum laws don't determine who gives evidence in court anymore or who gets the vote. This subpoint B doesn't make much sense because it actually allows these things under the current status quo. C, white Eurocentric government determining it is basically eroding self-determination and disenfranchising Indians. We ask how. We don't understand how current blood quantum laws are disenfranchising Indians because they allow Indians to vote in their own tribes versus random outsiders, which is what current blood quantum laws do. So therefore, we understand contention 1 doesn't make much sense. Then we have exclusionary practices. Subpoint 1, Cherokee Freeman example. But then they say that Cherokee Freemen and the Cherokee Chickasaw persons, but we tell them that this is discriminatory. Subpoint is discriminatory because they have imposed their Western values on the Cherokees and said they shouldn't expel persons who they don't think is in the tribe. If you buy their contention about we're imposing values, then that is an imposition of values right there. Because they can't tell the Cherokees how to govern based on racial identity. So that gets rid of contention subpoints A, B, and C about the Navajo and the small Californian tribe, because all of that is a value judgment on how Indians identify racial and cultural identity, and they can't do that because they don't have the agency to do that. Only the tribes can do that through their UQLs, and eroding it would be unequal and counter to their value. And as such, I urge you to vote negative and partner to talk about the final contention.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the member of government for an 8-minute constructive. And I'd like to remind the peanut gallery, if you want to knock, that's understandable, but we need to hear what they're saying. Okay, this is a very important round.
I'm going to speak at the podium. I might throw out voice a little bit. I don't really want to bend over, sorry. All right, so quick order. There's going to be kind of a reiteration of our definition of BQLs on top, then contentions 1 through 3 in order, and then case, same order it's been in, and then a extension on case at the end. So you can float as like contention 4 on case. All right, well, before I start time, I want to thank everyone for being here. This has been a really good round so far. I'm really excited to see how it ends up. I'd like to thank the adjudicatory panel for being here. I've seen all of you at this tournament. You spend all your time judging debate. I don't know what you do in your life outside of debate. I'd like to thank the huge peanut gallery for being here today. Without you, we'd just kind of be talking to walls, and the judges would be kind of awkward. So it's always good to have people in the room. And I'd like to thank the opposition team for being here today, proposing a good case. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get on to it. All right, first I'm going to reiterate our definition of BQLs. We define blood quantum laws as laws originally passed by the U.S. Congress and adopted by Native tribes to determine who is eligible for tribal enrollment based on racial makeup. They drop our definition of BQLs, which means everything they're saying about the tribes choosing isn't going to matter at the end because we're specifically talking about the laws that are passed in the U.S. Congress. They fundamentally drop this definition. Don't allow them to bring it up later. This literally takes out half of their speech in the last round. Now let's talk about contention 1. On contention 1, they say Indians should have control of citizenship. Once again, they accept our definition that we are specifically talking about the laws that Congress passes on to Indians. They say that they are somehow solving for colonialism. No, that's rooted in colonialism, right? It's rooted in placing these laws upon these marginalized people and further sending them to the periphery. Let's go on to their B point. They say this kills personal determination. No, you know what raises personal determination? Removing blood quantum laws. We're going to run a turn here and say that removing blood quantum laws incentivizes the Indians inside of the tribe. Now, let's go on to their C point. They say abolishing laws overexpands tribes. This is just fundamentally untrue, right? Because we're talking about the laws specifically passed down from the U.S. Congress. Yeah, first of two.
Okay. Okay, laws passed by the U.S. Congress were adopted by the tribes in your own definition. Therefore, we apply our tribal analysis to it. How is your definition not meet up to our contention?
Because you're insinuating through pretty much every one of your points that somehow the tribes are choosing these laws through every one of your contentions. But they're passed down from Congress. They're fundamentally rooted in the colonialism we're talking about, right? And I'll get onto that when I get onto case. So let's talk about overexpanding tribes. This doesn't lead to overexpanded tribes, right? Extend across my point that this actually incentivizes Indians to work harder within their tribes, right? They're not going to have this lingering spectrum of Western colonialism hanging on top of them. Now let's go on to contention 2. Their first point is blood quantum laws are a counter effect of colonialism. Our first point here is going to be this is counter-logical, right? Blood quantum laws are rooted in colonialism. Most of colonialism is defined by the marginalization and identification of people. Literally, let's think of all of the colonial things that have happened throughout history. They're all rooted in marginalizing certain people, picking certain people out, pushing them to the side. These are rooted in colonialism, and they're also rooted in calculative logic. And they say that tribes view this as a positive thing. So the tribes don't view blood quantum laws as a positive thing. I'm sure they would not, their choice is not to have the U.S. Congress be like, hey, you should probably pass this law. If not, we're probably going to defund you, which is something they fundamentally don't understand at the end of the day. Like, they're basically forced to pass these laws. Your second of 2.
Considering the fact that the blood quantum laws passed by Congress transfer agency to the tribes to determine their own cultural identity, how is this in any way not in the best interest of
The
the
blood
tribes?
quantum laws are passed by Congress and put upon the tribes with the notion that they will defund them if they do not pass the blood quantum laws. So it's either, do we give up our cultural identity and our chance of going on as a culture, or do we get defunded, right? It's literally that dichotomy that exists, and we think it's problematic. Let's go on to their second point on contention 2, which is blood quantum laws prevent watering down. They basically hit this point twice because it's in the first contention. I'm just going to say this ignores the ongoing genocide of the act, right? They completely drop our third contention. Don't allow them to bring that up. That's not how parliamentary debate procedure works. He said his partner's going to bring it up. You can't do that. It's called dropping something, which means we're going to win the cultural genocide contention. That ultimately they allow cultural genocide to persist. And let's go on to contention 3. They say colonialism has destroyed Indian identities, and that they're and then he critiques our definition of BQLs. He literally concedes our definition of BQLs is passed down from the government, which literally takes out. And if you're saying colonialism destroys Indian identities, yes, we saw better for colonialism. So I mean that's definitely a turn in favor of the government in this round. Now let's go on to case. There's a lot of interesting debate on case I want to talk about. All right, so they pretty much accept every one of our definitions. The only thing they say is that blood quantum laws have been reformed several times. Yes, who reforms these laws? The Congress, right? They're rooted in this colonial logic. He 100% is going to concede this at the end of the round. And it's still rooted in discrimination, right? They change it, but it's constantly rooted in discrimination. The ultimate idea behind blood quantum laws is literally marginalizing people and singling people out. And they say one tribe changed. We still get access to solvency. This isn't a solvency mitigator at all. There are still tons of tribes where they are marginalized by the blood quantum laws. And they say this one tribe changed. No, they still have blood quantum laws that are handed down from the U.S. Congress. And extend across, they accept our value of equality and ethics. At the end of the round, they don't clearly specify to you how they're accessing equality and ethics by keeping blood quantum laws in place. Their only thing is that they're not rooted in colonialism. That's the only thing I got literally out of their entire case. Now let's go on to contention 1. Extend across our point that they extend from prima laws, and that's fundamentally a European institution, and it's rooted in racism. They say this is reverse racism. No, it's not reverse racism. Let's think of the entire logic behind blood quantum laws. It's literally the U.S. government singling out Native Americans and being like, you know what, we should put a law on you so we can determine that this person is Native American, this person is Native American, right? It's literally rooted in racism. The colonial logic is 100% rooted in racism. Any person can understand how this is rooted in racism. Let's go on to our B point. The laws are created by the U.S. to determine how someone is Indian. This leads to the white is right box, which he's talking about. I'm going to explain this more in our fourth contention, which is going to be a contention about Foucault and marginalization and why that should probably matter in the context of the affirmative. Let's go on to our C point. The U.S. government used laws to determine citizenry and access to benefits. They dropped this. The U.S. government is fundamentally doing this. The U.S. government has always done this. I've already given you 2. And this leads to marginalization. Dropped. Let's go on to the D point. Millions of Native Americans are disenfranchised. They say, how are they disenfranchised? Let's think. Native Americans aren't given the same access to citizenry as everyone else. I'm not specifically singled out by the U.S. government being like, you know what, Hunter, you should fall under a blood quantum law. I'm going to defund you if you don't abide by blood quantum law. They're specifically singled out. Let's go really quickly on to contention 2 and 3. The laws are abused by governments, and we give the Freedmen example and then the Californians example. They say value judgment isn't the answer, but they concede our value. So I'm really confused on what that means. I don't think it's a voter at the end of the round. So extend across our C point that's deeply rooted in racism and exclusion. Now let's go to cultural genocide. Cultural genocide is 100% dropped. It's going to be on your ballot at the end of the round. You can't literally just drop things and expect to win in a final round. So extend across our A point. The only way to assume citizenship is to marry in a tribe. And in the next 4 to 6 generations, we will die off. So now you have to understand an opposition ballot literally means you're letting these Indians die off, right? They're literally locked inside this cage. If they want to remain an Indian, they have to marry inside the tribe, right? And they say they're not excluded anyhow and not disenfranchised. They're disenfranchised just like that. So cross-apply that to the point on disenfranchisement. Now let's go on to the marginalization extended. Our A point is going to be blood quantum laws reinforce the paradigm that certain peoples are worthy of exclusion and separation. Our B point is going to be, as philosopher Michel Foucault would say, this allows the marginalized and disenfranchised to die off. Our C point is going to be, this logic extends into our interactions with the other and is the primary impetus behind genocide. Let's think of all genocides that we can think of. Rwanda, the Ukrainian terror force, the Holocaust, Armenia. All of these are literally rooted in shoving people into boxes, which is what the U.S. government does when it passes blood quantum laws, specifically upon Native Americans. They don't debate at all that the U.S. government does this specifically to target Native Americans at the end of the round, which means that there's going to be a clear ballot, there's going to be a clear government ballot that we actually access equality right in the round. We actually access our value and criterion because we're abolishing the laws that are rooted in colonial logic and racism. And for all of these reasons, I ask for a strong affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the member of opposition for an 8-minute constructive.
All right. So, before we start time, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, our opponents for presenting a very good and strong substantiated case, my partner for presenting our arguments, you as the adjudicating panel for deciding who wins the round today, and of course the peanut gallery for being here to listen to this excellent debate. Just a roadmap for you. I'm going to go off case and look at our contentions and look at the reputation, and then I'll go on case and deal with their points in order. But of course, I'll start with this framing of the blood quantum law. All right. So with that, let's begin. All right. I think it's very important that we recognize an overarching principle today, which I'll get to in a second. But I want to talk about this blood quantum definition law. The key argument that we're making here is that the blood quantum laws in Congress transfer agency. Okay, this is the key. The blood quantum laws transfer agency. And we believe that insofar as this is the case, our analysis on this point that comes out in the first opposition speech should be flowed through and is preferable. So with that, let's move on to our first contention, which essentially is that the abolition of blood quantum laws violates Native Americans' right to self-determination. Essentially, what they're saying is they're trying to put a turn on our argument. But the turn really doesn't exist, and it makes no logical sense. Why? Because what we're saying is that Native Americans should be allowed to determine tribal membership. The crux of this issue is, do blood quantum laws allow Native Americans to be self-determined, or do they create marginalization? We clearly show in our off case that marginalization is not the effect of blood quantum laws. Okay, we show that if we accept their arguments, no standard for tribal membership exists. And we get to that more in our analysis. But we see that essentially accepting their arguments, accepting their incentive argument that they put forth, doesn't recognizing that the abolition of blood quantum laws to determine tribal membership essentially waters down what it means to be a Navajo or a Cherokee. And they don't really adequately refute this point. So moving on to our second contention, counter-colonialism, essentially they say that colonialism equals marginalization. But insofar as we as the opposition team have adequately refuted the idea that frames their case that blood quantum laws create marginalization, we see that our contention stands and their analysis falls. We have to recognize that blood quantum laws are currently the only mechanism through which Native American tribes determine who is a member of the tribe. When we eliminate that, we open a free-for-all. This is very key. Okay? Further, they make this point that tribes are forced to pass laws. But this is not true, because we recognize that the tribes have the agency transferred, and this is key, the transfer of agency. We recognize that. So the tribes, Congress doesn't force the tribes to pass the laws. Let's finally look at this destruction of identity idea, which becomes very important, which they don't really adequately address. Okay, what we're saying is the arrival of Europeans changed group identity, and that the concerns of Native Americans have been commodified and essentially expropriated through continuing colonialism. Okay, Europeans basically expropriated Indian identity. And we see this shift from a cultural definition to a purely legalistic and arbitrary definition set forth. And we, as the opposition team, believe that you should not prefer the arbitrary bounds or lack thereof set forth by our opponents. And for that reason, we believe that you prefer our case at the end of the round. But let's move on case for a moment and examine some of the analysis that gets provided in the last speech. Okay, we have to recognize, just briefly going through the res analysis, of course we agree to the criteria, we're looking at ethics, okay, so that's all well and clear. We have to recognize with their first point, okay, they say that the United States government is singling out Native Americans and that blood quantum laws are rooted in racism. But this isn't true. Why? Because blood quantum laws are compensatory. We recognize that this is a key point, because if we recognize that blood quantum laws are compensatory, things like the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment were also compensatory. So would our opponents have us get rid of those too, simply because we have a compensatory mechanism that's being realized? But you would disagree.
All right, so my question is basically, so you're saying blood quantum laws which pass through the U.S. are not like American-centric at all?
What we're saying is that blood quantum laws, we have a transfer of agency from Congress to the tribes. It's the tribal standard that upholds who and who is not a member of the tribe, which is very key. But the compensatory example that we use is very, very crucial to our understanding of the round. So we also see that when we recognize our case, their entire first contention and all of their sub-points about racism simply no longer apply. And I'll extend the cross-application that my partner put on the flow. They say essentially that this is rooted in racism. We argue that it reverses racism, and our compensatory point proves that to be true. But you would disagree in a second question.
All right, so do blood quantum laws, again with the same question, do blood quantum laws exist for any other culture in America than Native Americans?
We are talking specifically about blood quantum laws for Native
Do
Americans.
they exist? So it's just a question.
I have to move on to your other points. So second, we recognize this idea of exclusionary practices. Okay, this becomes very important. They talk about how exclusion is bad, but let's recognize some of the important aspects of blood quantum laws. Okay, because blood quantum laws allow tribes to self-determine who is a member of that given tribe. It allows their cultural unity to flourish. It allows it allows tribes to have the ability to determine who is a member. And why is this important? This is important because that way you don't get 100 or 1 and 686, percentage Native American people trying to claim and access government benefits related specifically to Native Americans. So we see that the self-determination point is crucial. So their exclusionary practice simply doesn't stand, and neither do their sub-contentions. Now let's move on to this discussion of cultural genocide and marginalization. I'm in a constructive speech right now, and my partner stated that I would address the third contention and I'll also address the fourth contention. And I'm perfectly fine because we're just addressing these contentions now. If in the rebuttal, my opponents get up and provide counter-analysis to what we have. But let's recognize that we're not actually creating cultural genocide. Why? Because we're preserving the autonomy and the agency of Native American tribes. We are allowing for self-determination. And this is really the key at the end of the round. Self-determination versus marginalization. They get up here and they talk about, in their fourth contention, and I'm lumping their third and their fourth, they talk about paradigms and Foucault, and they bring up a couple of other subpoints, but we recognize that when we preserve the agency, when we see that blood quantum laws compensate for essentially the negative effects of colonialism, which we address in our off case, the taking of land, for example, we see that blood quantum laws should not be abolished. And this becomes very, very crucial as we understand the round. So let's step back and examine through two worlds what we have at the end of the round. If we accept the government team's understandings, they live in a world where anyone who has any blood heritage, blood relation to Native Americans can claim Native American membership and can access those benefits. In our world, we believe in self-determination. We believe that Native American tribes have the ability to determine the people whom they recognize as culturally, tribally related to them. We believe that self-autonomy is very important, and we believe that blood quantum laws support Native Americans, and that Native American tribes are allowed to flourish as a result because they provide a standard with which tribes can determine membership. That's not marginalization. Native American tribes are not marginalized, and the blood quantum laws, as I believe that we've adequately refuted, aren't based in this colonial mindset that our opponents on the government side would have you believe. So for all of those reasons, based on the criteria provided, based on the off case and the on case, we as the opposition request a strong ballot in our favor.
Thanks. I'd like to recognize the Leader of Opposition for a 4-minute rebuttal. Please remember, no new arguments, but I don't protect, so you do have to call the point of orders. None of us protect.
Okay, Judge, brief roadmap. I'm going to clarify a few points. I'm going to clarify first a Congress point that I think is kind of becoming an odd point in this round. And then I'm going to clarify this idea of it being asked for other groups. I'm going to clarify the exclusionary practice argument and giving the voters. That being said, let's begin time. Okay, so essentially the argument coming from the affirmative team is that because the U.S. Congress does it, it's automatically bad. This is a substantive argument, first of all. It's essentially, they claim it's some imposition by the white people in Congress, and therefore it's bad. However, the truth is that blood quantum laws, as their definition states, are, try to become close to it, laws passed in Congress adopted by Indian tribes that allow them to define who is a citizen in their tribe based on bloodline. That's what blood quantum laws do. However, because they were passed by the U.S. Congress, because that's the sovereign legislature in the land, the government team claims that they're U.S.-centric in nature, they have some semblance of Eurocentrism, and as such, their effects should be disregarded, and how we characterize it is what's more important in this round. It's not. Because essentially the tribes are not countries. As such, the state, in an effort to reverse the effects of colonialism and cultural erasure, give the tribes this agency. This is not in any way unequal. This restores equality, and because they can claim that it's because white people in Congress passed this law, that isn't a substantive argument to totally destroy the positive effects of these things in upholding their own value of equality. Additionally, to argue that because Congress transferred its agency is symbolically racist and it's automatically bad, this is not, it's like to say, like my partner said, the 14th Amendment Voting Rights Act were passed by a bunch of old white guys in Congress. Does it stink of Eurocentrism and we should repeal it even though it has given black people the right to vote? Exactly as the logic that I've said, that it stinks of Eurocentrism, it's rooted in racism, and therefore ignore it. It's unequal because they passed it, even if it gives agency to the marginalized group. If they're upholding equality and this Eurocentric law promotes equality for the once marginalized group, then they bite their own value and not upholding it by the Eurocentric ideals. Now to move on to the second important thing, they claim that, they ask the question over and over that it's important, do these laws exist for other groups? No, as I said before, because no other tribe in America had their civilizations uprooted, there's no other blood quantum law for any other group. That's why. It's simple as that. It's compensatory. So it doesn't really make much sense to say that no other tribe gets it, so it's bad, no other group gets it because it's bad. It's compensatory in nature. It restores equality. They're supposed to be upholding the value of equality. Stop shooting the value in the foot. And then what they have now is this contention about exclusionary practices. This contention, I think, is 3. Where I talk about the Cherokee Freemen, the California tribes in Navajo, and I clearly say all of these contentions are, all of these subpoints are really terms, because what they've done, they've claimed that the self-determination of the Cherokee tribes is exclusionary and therefore it's bad. That's contradictory to equality, because, and they don't answer this point, I say that imposes their own value on the Cherokee persons. That imposes whatever Western concoction that they're talking about on the California persons who were expelled. And it says that these tribes shouldn't have the right to determine who is in their tribe. And if they don't have the right, then who does? I'm assuming it's a said U.S. Congress, which therefore makes it unequal once again. So I have to point again, Judge, that they're not upholding their own value through their contentions. And my partner spoke about this cultural genocide not making any sense, because it really doesn't make much sense, because blood quantum laws preserve any possible protection against cultural genocide. Why? Because it allows for the lack of cultural invasion and erasure from an open set of laws. They don't respond to this adequately. What are our voters? Our voters will be our three main contentions: equals equality. Self-determination equals equality. Upholds the value, they don't refute this adequately. They simply say, the Congress did it. That's most of the margin of their responses, judges. So I want you to vote for self-determination. Vote for reversing colonialism because it restores equality. They don't refute this. Vote for preserving identity because it repeats equality. We uphold the value, we win the round.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the Prime Minister for a 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay, so before I start my time, I just want to thank the opposition team for a wonderful round, and I guess thank the judges, and we'll get right into this. Okay, so I have several voters that I need to get through. The first voter is going to be the marginalization contention. This contention, which was our contention 4 in Hunter's speech, goes fundamentally dropped. They try to group this contention with contention 3, which are actually mutually exclusive and cannot be grouped. So extend that the paradigm behind blood quantum laws reinforces the exclusion and marginalization of certain peoples. Extend that this allows the Native Americans to die off. The logic that is behind this is actually genocidal in nature, so that's really important. Second contention, self-determination. Self-determination ended up being one of the most important topics in this round. Our opponents would argue that Native Americans are allowed self-determination because of these laws, but we understand that these laws are actually rooted in colonialism. They say that blood quantum laws help Native Americans perpetuate their culture because they are allowed to decide. But like I said in my first speech, in their actual traditional ways, tribes can adopt whoever they want and not have to exclude people because they are not a certain race. And as Hunter pointed out, it's really not self-determination at all, because the U.S. government basically forces them to adopt these different blood quantum measures in order to receive funding. So it's completely colonialism. The United States is still committing genocide against these people by forcing them to adopt these laws and forcing them, meaning that they don't have their own sovereignty anymore. It's horrible. Okay, so that leads me to the third voter, which is colonialism. Again, our opponents say that our points about blood quantum laws being rooted in colonialism don't matter, since Native Americans can now determine their own laws. However, like Hunter said, the U.S. is still a colonial actor by forcing these laws through. They accuse us of imposing Western values on Native Americans by saying that blood quantum laws shouldn't exist, but that's just totally ridiculous, right? We advocate in our very first speech for traditional measures like adoption into the tribe instead of actually adopting these European practices that are completely rooted in colonialism. Okay, next voter, cultural genocide. Our opponents totally dropped this point in their first constructive, but you have to understand that if the blood quantum trend continues, this is extremely important, Native Americans will no longer continue to exist, according to the U.S. government, in 4 to 6 generations. A vote for the opposition is literally a vote in favor of this cultural genocide and in favor of literally destroying these people. We can't allow that to happen. Next voter, dehumanization. The opposition would have you believe that Native Americans need some method imposed on them to decide who is Native American, but can't we all just agree that these tribes can decide who is Native American and who is not Native American without Big Daddy American government telling them how to do it? I think that seems reasonable. They are forced to accept these laws, and ultimately they are the only human group in the world that must prove that they are what they are. They are the only group in the world that can birth a child, and that child is suddenly not considered Native American anymore. That's really problematic, because suddenly that child is totally disenfranchised from their tribe just because of a law that the U.S. Congress pushes on these tribes. They can't receive benefits anymore. They can't apply to specific Native American scholarships. It's just really problematic because they're no longer receiving these benefits. All right, next voter, exclusion. Our opponents would have you believe that it is somehow good to be forced to exclude certain people from their citizenry, but they fundamentally misunderstand that Native Americans historically were able to determine these things without the interference of the U.S. government. We make that real clear in our first speech, that this is not traditional, this is not Native American in nature, this is European in nature, right? So they were able to determine these things before, but they are actually like incredibly offensive in suggesting that it is better to rely on these European institutions to determine identity than relying on their traditional ones. It's more ethical, going back to our criterion and value, to allow Indians to determine their citizenry based on other means than like exclusion based on race. That's just totally horrible. No other group in the country is allowed to do this, but it's something that we force on Native Americans. It's really problematic. Self-determination is not accepting advice from the U.S. government. It's just not, I'm sorry. All right, last voter is equality. We fundamentally are treating these Native American groups as unequal by marginalizing them to the periphery, where they are the only group in the nation, actually in the world, that has to actually prove their ancestry. Blood quantum is not compensatory in nature at all. It is genocide in nature. Like, they never really go into this point about how blood quantum is because we were destroying them, and so now we have to like give them a method to determine their own identity. That just doesn't make sense. It's completely genocide. It's the U.S. government imposing these laws so that in 4 to 6 generations, Native Americans will no longer exist. They no longer have to give them benefits. Like I said in my first speech, they can just take back all the reservation land that they've given to these groups of people, and that's all just really problematic because suddenly the group ceases to exist, and I think that that's most important at the end of the round. We cannot advocate just like destroying these people. That's really wrong. So for all those reasons, I have to insist on a government ballot. Thank you.
All right, everybody, down the hall.
I need to go.
Thank you.